Good day, everyone, and welcome to another Live with Kevin, which will eventually be, as you can see over my shoulder, an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad that you are here. Our guest will be joining us shortly. Actually, she's sitting here watching, but you can't see her. She'll be here with us in a second. So I am glad that you're here. And since you're here, especially if you're with us live and not watching this later, I hope that you will go into the comments and whatever social platform you're in and say hello. Tell us where you're listening from, watching from, learning from. That would be great for me to know and for my guests to know and just for the others here learning with you to know. So do that. Say hello. Tell us where you're at today. And as long as you're here with us live, I'd like for you to imagine that you are joining my guest and I, and we're all around the same table and we're having a chat. And if you were there and you had a question, you would ask it. If you had a comment, you would share it. And if you had an idea, you would offer it. So do that here too. If you have those ideas, if you have those questions, if you have those comments, share them, because that'll make for a better conversation for all of us now. It'll make for a better podcast episode eventually. And most of all for you, it'll give you the chance to get your questions answered. So everybody wins, right? So that's what I hope that you will do. And if people are doing those comments, I'll see them in a minute. I'll put some on the screen. If you love what you're seeing here, I promise that you would love our upcoming event called Virtual LeaderCon. And you can learn more about Virtual LeaderCon by going to virtualleadercon.com, where on the 20th and 21st of September, I'll be doing 2 days working with 12 thought leaders from around the world on a variety of topics that all are meant to help you as a leader and as a human being, much like what we do here every week on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And just like this podcast, if you join in for Virtual LeaderCon, it's completely free. Yeah, there are ways you can get access to all of the some other goodies, but you can join us for free. I hope you'll do that. Go to virtualleadercon.com. So having said all that, I'm going to do the countdown, which will be the start of the actual podcast episode. And so we'll do that in, Marissa, this is for you. 3, 2, 1. Question: how rested do you feel now? And how often do you feel well rested? Many of us, for a variety of reasons, don't prioritize rest, but we look for solutions to many of the problems that a lack of rest can cause. Today, we're going to talk about how to discover calm and understand the radical power of rest. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively, make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. And if you're listening to this podcast, we do these live. So for future episodes, you could join us live, hear the information sooner, interact with us. So why not do that? You can learn about when we're doing those live episode recordings by going to our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn or remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook to get all of that information. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com. That's longdistanceteambook.com, where you can get an excerpt, learn more, and get caught up with all things about teams at a distance. And now, without any further ado, the reason that you really came was just to hear from our guest. And let me introduce her. She is coming back for the second time to join us on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Her name is Ximena Vengoechea, which I cannot say nearly as well as she can. She will correct me if I am incorrect. And I am so excited to have her with us here today. She is a user researcher, writer, and illustrator whose work on personal and professional development has been published in Inc., The Washington Post, Newsweek, Forbes, and the Huffington Post. She is the author of 2 books, Listen Like You Mean It, Reclaiming the Lost Art of True Connection, and her latest, Rest Easy, discover calm and abundance through the radical power of rest. She is a contributor to Fast Company and The Muse and writes her newsletter, Letters from Ximena, about staying curious, getting creative, and living well. She's also the creator of the popular project, The Life Audit, which she was telling me about during our time before we started. She is a keynote speaker on topics such as empathetic and inclusive listening, navigating difficult conversations, and preventing burnout. She's worked at places like LinkedIn and Pinterest and Twitter, and currently advises select startups and executives on user research, executive communication, and, not surprisingly, resting well. Ximena, thank you for joining us. Welcome back to the podcast, 2021, and now here we are again.
Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be back.
So let's tell us a little bit about your journey, sort of how you end up doing this kind of work, if you would, because I think that journey will help set up why this book.
Yes. Well, the story behind this book in particular has to do with all of the things that I was doing beforehand. So you were reading my bio, which has a lot of commas or a lot of slashes, user researcher / writer / illustrator. And it's true. I was working in the tech industry for many years as a user researcher. That is a role which requires talking to people, trying to understand their needs and motivations in order to build better products. It's actually a little bit sad now seeing at least one of the companies I've worked at being completely changed, knowing that they're maybe not doing quite as much research as they should be, but I digress. I did some research, and then that led to my first book, which is about listening, since that is a core capability of the user research function.
An excellent book. And
Thank
we'll have
you.
in the show notes the links to that conversation. Go ahead.
Thank you.
While you're talking, for those who are watching, I will show some of the illustrations in the new book. Keep going. I'm
Yes.
just show illustrations
and while I was, working on my first book, I was also working my 9 to 5. Also became a mother. Also, the pandemic happened. All the alsos, right? There were a lot of things that I had on my plate. And at the time, I really approached it as just, putting one foot in front of the other. Just keep going. Just keep going. And that was okay. It was not great. And I think once I, kind of got to the other side of that, where the book was out, my son started going to daycare. I had a moment to sort of just be. I realized how exhausted I really was. And I sort of allowed myself to recognize that I was burnt out and that there was a reason that I was feeling the way that I was, which was sort of a little bit listless, a little bit unmotivated, and very tired. And that led to this new book, because one of the first things I did when I realized how burnt out I really was, after many months of kind of debating, like, well, should I leave my job? How should I manage this? And eventually I did leave my 9 to 5 to focus on writing full time. I had in my mind that, one, this might be temporary. So this might be something where, I take a break and I'll feel better in 6 weeks. I'll feel
fine. That's
fine.
what you said in the book. Well, I figured in 2 or 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
I'd feel better.
Yeah. I was like, I just need a little break, and then I'll hit the job, then I'll hit the job hunt again. It's fine. That turned out to be very naive, totally wrong. Because those weeks just flew by and I still didn't feel quite energized the way that I used to. And that really set me on a journey of trying to understand how to recover from this feeling of burnout, what needed to change moving forward. And also, what needed to change sort of like right now in order to start feeling better. And it was a big sort of wake-up call to realize that I didn't really know how to rest. I had been taught, I think many of us are taught, whether, explicitly or just it's the culture that we live in and what we pick up on in the world. I think many of us have a sense of, what it means to work, what it means to work hard, what a work ethic is. We have values around work. I don't think I'm alone in feeling that the rest piece of that, the rest side of that, is much less explored and understood. And so that's really where I started.
So, so first of all, when a book shows up, or when the announcement a book is coming from you, because of the first one, I was immediately interested, and because I read your newsletter and all those things. But then to know that it was going to be about rest, I thought was really fascinating. And I think that for those of us that are here, we are probably, many of them are much like you, very results driven, very much focused on lots of different things. Many of you are probably listening to this while you're doing something else, which we will get to that in a few minutes. So I was really fascinated to have this conversation, because I think it's one that we need to have. I said in the open, we don't think about rest, but we look for ways to solve all the stuff that happens when we don't get it. Right. So one of the things you say, you don't spend a lot of time on it, but one of the things you say early in the book is that there are really 3 types of rest. So can you just talk about that? Because I think that in itself, to me, was, I think very illuminating, and I think will be helpful to people.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, when we think about rest, one of the first things that comes to mind is sleep. That rest and sleep are interchangeable, that they're synonymous in some way. And sleep is definitely a form of rest, and it's absolutely crucial. And we can go into it if you'd like. It makes a big difference, but it's not the only kind of rest. And you can get, the right amount of sleep and still feel exhausted or fatigued mentally and in other ways. And so when I talk about rest, what I'm really looking at are 3 types. And so there's mental rest, like ways to rest your mind. So if you have ever been on a vacation and found it hard to mentally unplug from work or whatever stresses are going on in your mind, you know that there's a difference between, laying on a beach and looking like you're relaxing and then truly mentally relaxing. There can be a gap in your experience. So there's mental rest, trying to quiet our minds and really tamp down any anxiety or just quiet the thoughts. There's also physical rest, which I think is the type of rest that many of us are sort of more intuitively drawn to or understand. So sleep, people talk about yoga or getting massages. There's lots of things that you can do with your body to help calm yourself down, or to energize you, which I think is the other side of rest, right? The activities that we do will either calm us or energize us. And then there's resting your spirit. So it's not just about physically calming or energizing or mentally doing that, but also spiritually, and when I say spiritually, for some people that will be organized religion, but for many people, it will be taking in the sunset and feeling moved by that and feeling a sense of inner peace by what we're seeing, or watching, a beautiful dance performance, something that we are moved by. And I think that is another kind of rest that we can begin to tune into and really nourish ourselves with.
Yeah, I love that idea of the word nourish, as it relates to this. And I think one thing I think that I hope everyone will sort of mentally underline that you just said is this idea not only of rest to calm, but rest to energize, right? And I think that's one of the things we misunderstand about rest. I think another thing we misunderstand is we associate it with sleep, right? But what else, or in what other ways do we misunderstand rest, sort of societally, if you will?
I think that there is a general sense that rest is something that we have to earn in some way, um, as opposed to rest simply being something that is as basic as food and water. There's, in our culture, there's this idea of, you have to earn it. You have to do the things on your to-do list first. You have to achieve the thing, get the promotion and then take the vacation,
Then
whatever
we
it
can
is.
rest, right?
Right. So but you've got a pretty long list. And what's complicated about that too is that list can keep growing, right? Like there is always more that you can add to that list.
Well, let's just be clear. There is no one that's ever going to have 0 on the to-do list. So when we think the to-do list is going to be empty or the inbox is going to be 0, like even if it would be momentarily, right? So like, isn't that just the wrong way to think about it, right?
Yeah. And there's, to give ourselves a little bit of credit, there's a reason we have this kind of thinking. And this thinking is in the media, it's in our culture, it's how many people use social media, right? It's very achievement oriented. It's very like, let me show you what I'm capable of. It's got roots, in the Protestant work ethic, which is something that we don't necessarily think about, but it's really been internalized. This idea that like work is good, rest is bad, potentially, or rest is something we can only do if we've been good, if we've achieved, if we've accomplished those things.
So since and you mentioned this in the book, you
Mhm.
talk about the Protestant work ethic, which is sort of an American thing, at least generally speaking. So my question would be this: in researching the book, is this is this book more needed in the U.S. than in the rest of the world, or not?
I mean, I would put the U.S. as like one of the top. I mean, I think there are other countries that also, have similar challenges. But yeah, I mean, you look elsewhere. I spent a few years living in France after graduating from college, and there's just it's a different pace. It's 2 hours over a leisurely lunch. There's an enjoyment of food, a savoring. Um, there's not the American, like, grab your cereal bar on your way to work and,
I'm in
shovel
a
your
hurry to
food
get things
in.
done, right?
Yeah, right. And so it's different. And so I do think there are some cultural differences um, that make it a little more challenging for us Americans to prioritize rest.
Okay, so other than sort of the societal stuff, and not to downplay that because I think that's really important, and I'm guessing that as I felt it reading, and I'm sure as others are feeling it listening right now, uh, what else gets in our way? Like, why else besides those things? Why don't we do it? Why haven't we prioritized it?
I think part of it is, personal. So there's the big picture, but then part of it is also personal, right? It has to do with your personality. And so some of us, for example, feel guilty if we are taking time for ourselves. There is a belief that we would be better served by offering that time to others, whether that is at work or at home. Which is another area where you see this, which is, I can't take time for myself. I have to take care of the kids first, or I have to take care of, my partner first. Whoever it is in your life, I think there can be, especially around family, a strong sense of guilt that I can't take the time for myself until I manage that. It's also true that some of us are very achievement oriented, and rest is somewhat hard to see in a traditional sense. So when you are achievement oriented, you're thinking about, the thing that you're going to accomplish. And the thing can be something tangible, like I got a I got a raise, like that's tangible, right? I have a promotion, I have a new title, new scope. Um,
I've got this
I
project finished.
I've
I've
got this
written this
project.
book.
I've written this
Right
book.
on, right?
Exactly. It's like, I can literally, like, I can show you the book. It's right here, right?
Right here.
It's right there. Exactly. And there is something about rest which is sort of invisible, right? Like you don't necessarily show up to work or at a party and talk about like, oh yeah, I rested so much. It was so great. Like it's not the same sort of like pat on the back that we give
Look at
ourselves.
me resting, right?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
there's a comment came in from LinkedIn, and it says that FOMO is also a problem. Do you want to talk about FOMO for a second? It took me a long time before I knew what that even was, but now I do know what it is. I actually shot a video about it a while back. But so FOMO, fear of missing out, how does that play into all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the rise of FOMO, as it were, really aligns with social media and how we're using social media. And there's a lot of documenting of our achievements or our wins, and that can look like, me celebrating a big professional moment, or me on a gorgeous vacation, with friends and family. It can look like a lot of different things. But the idea that there is always something else that you could be doing, or a part of, which maybe you were invited to, maybe you weren't, yes, it can add to additional pressure every time we have a moment to ourselves to say, well, am I going to take this moment, or should I be doing this other thing? Or why am I not doing this other thing that I'm hearing about? So yeah, I would agree that that is an additional pressure.
Yeah, we're back to the shoulds.
Right.
We really should stop shoulding ourselves, if you will. So I'm curious your take. I mean, you mentioned um, after the last book, then we had a pandemic, uh, and I don't think there's any question that there's been a lot more talk about mental health um, since the start of the pandemic, and it's become, I think, more socially acceptable to talk about mental health than it's ever been before. Um, there's a connection here. So my question to you is, as it relates to rest specifically, what have been the impacts, positive or negative, of the pandemic or now post pandemic on this topic of rest and how we deal with it, think about it, et cetera?
I think the positive is that there is much more conversation around um, around burnout. I think many people are using it in their vocabulary in a way that wasn't necessarily happening before. I think even the use of burnout, for example, by parents is somewhat new. It used to be more exclusively applied to just office workers. Now we sort of see, oh, you can be burnt out in many different environments. It's not just, do I show up to an office every day? So I think that anytime that we're having a discussion around this and saying out loud, there's a problem here, that's a good thing. Where I think we still have a ways to go is on the solution side. So there's very much an awareness that these are issues. I don't think yet that we've cracked the solutions. I think what we're seeing is kind of like a first wave of responses to this, of companies offering more mental health days, and managers checking in more with their direct reports around their workload and their burnout, and all of those things are good. But we also do need like bigger organizational changes, maybe even policy changes, to help with these things. There are other countries that have, by law, way more vacation days
Right.
than the average American. That's not something that a worker has to negotiate. If you're in France or if you're in Japan, you have this set like three or more weeks, right? So there are changes that I think we can each make in our everyday lives. And also there are changes that do need to happen, probably at a slower pace, but at a larger scale as well.
I think that's fair. So there's something else that I mentioned earlier, and you smiled when I said it. Is that people may be listening to us, especially on the podcast, maybe listening to us while they're doing something else. So the idea of multitasking. I think I know how you feel about this, but I don't think we can have this conversation in 2023 and not bring up this idea of multitasking. So I want to do that. And then I want to get to some of these suggestions, some very specific things that you suggest in the book before we finish up. But just anything you want to say about multitasking?
Yes, multitasking, we all do it. So I'll just say that first, but it's not great for us. It's really not restful. So when we talk about mental
Not
rest,
even productive, but it's
no,
certainly not
it's not
restful.
productive, but it's definitely not restful. When we talk about mental rest and trying to quiet our minds, we're not doing ourselves any favors with much of multitasking. Multitasking we think of as doing more than one thing at once. But what's actually happening is we're just rapidly switching between tasks. The brain is not, it's not doing what we think it's doing. And when we are switching back and forth, we're using a lot of energy. So it would be, we would be expending less cognitive energy by just focusing on the one thing and seeing it through. When we toggle back and forth, that's where we wind up mentally fatigued. We make mistakes. We are, as you say, not actually as productive as we think we are. We feel really good, answering that Slack message and then answering the email and going back and forth, but it actually takes us a bit of time every time we make a switch to recover and get back in the zone. And I think this is pretty obvious in a work setting, but it spills over too to the rest of our days, where we are just generally pretty distracted. We experience what researchers call time confetti, where your day is sort of like broken up into small chunks, instead of something meaningful where you can look back and be in that moment in a more prolonged way. So multitasking is really, it's not going to leave you feeling energized. It's going to leave you feeling mentally fatigued.
Okay, so let's talk about some suggestions, and there are a bunch of them in the book. I'm going to mention a couple, and then maybe if we have time, I'll have you mention one of your favorites. But before we do that, we have to talk about the devices and the technology and the screens. And I recognize the paradox or irony of this, that we're going to have this conversation, and that's how people are going to consume this conversation, right? Is on their technology. But you, as others as well, talk about taking a break from the screen or screens. And well, we've all heard this, but give us a couple pieces of advice that you would give about how to do that effectively.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is I'm definitely not anti-tech, as you heard in my bio, right? I've worked in these tech companies, and so I know firsthand, some of the benefits, but also, yes, the drawbacks too. And so when it comes to carving out that mental space and giving ourselves peace of mind, we do have to think about how we will incorporate our devices into our everyday lives and whether our tech habits are helping or harming us. And so there's a range of experiments that you can do, from what I would say are the very challenging to the somewhat easier. One of the more challenging, but I think worth exploring, activities is a tech Shabbat. So you can take an entire day, once a week, where you totally unplug your devices, and just are in the moment. You print out the directions you might need or the recipes you might need, but you turn off all of your devices. For some people, that feels really challenging because they want to be reachable, or they're worried about, in case of emergency. It's not for everyone, but
Well,
I
you know
think it's
what?
worth
We all
trying.
lived through that before. Like
That's right.
it can be done.
Yes, it can definitely be done. And I think, it can sound harder than it is, in the sense that if you've ever gone camping, someplace without service, like you've done this before, right? But it's about being more intentional and doing this on a more regular basis. Um,
And even you say you think you can do it about once a quarter. You're not trying to do it every
yes,
week, although you suggested once a week. So
yes,
I think that's helpful too, because I think people say, oh, I can do that once a week, but I could try it once and I could
absolutely.
see, and then I could use that as a part of my overall process. I guess that's probably the kind of thing that people might have expected us to talk about. But I doubt if anyone who's listening has ever even thought of an idea that I loved, called creative waiting. Talk about creative waiting as a strategy to help us get some rest.
Yeah. So, if you think about, the many moments in our day that maybe are somewhat, whether they're planned or unplanned, where we have an instinct to just tap on our phones in some way, and kind of shut out the world around us, think about those moments as opportunities to rest. So, sometimes, let's say you're at the doctor's office, you're waiting for an appointment, maybe they're even delayed. That's a lot of the times, that's when many of us will kind of tune out and just go down the rabbit hole on our devices. Creative waiting is really giving yourself an opportunity to observe and notice what's happening around you, and to use this as time to connect with those surroundings in some way. Tell a story in your head about what's happening, at the doctor's office. Notice the shades of red around you. All of these are ways to not just serve as an alternative to using your device, which we know isn't restful, but also to give your brain a break, in the sense that usually if you're not occupied with a device, your mind is running, right? In fact, that may be why we, turn to the device. It's a way of kind of shutting that down. So when you focus on these little details in your environment, that is also going to help quiet your mind, and give you a moment of rest, and is a way to turn maybe a moment that you weren't looking forward to, waiting at the doctor's office, into something restful, into something that comes with ease.
One of the things when I was reading that I was thinking about, Ximena, was the situations, and certainly the doctor's office would be one, but most of us, hopefully, are not going to doctor's offices very often. But some of us are doing things like getting on airplanes way more often than we go to the doctor. And so many people talk about, oh, I hate the time in the airport, all the waiting, especially if there's a delay. And I think if you just took this approach in and of itself, it might totally change not only how you experience that waiting and that delay, but also might really be very healthy for you, because so often travel can be stressful and exhausting and all those other things. And if we can do some things in that to help us actually be revived in that time, I think it can be very helpful. It's one of the things I thought of as I was reading that particular one.
Yeah, and there's so many of these moments throughout the day. There's grocery shopping, right? There's looking for a parking spot where you're maybe multitasking at the same time. Just, turn off the radio for a second. Take in your surroundings, right? There's so many times that throughout the day, small moments come up that we can just be present for.
You might even find a closer parking spot. So another thing you talk about is something called finding your play zone. Finding your play zone. What do you mean by that?
Well, play is interesting. I think that when we think about rest, it's not necessarily obvious that play can be a form of rest. But when you think about play, you're doing something that you enjoy, that you find fun. Maybe there's some effort involved, but it's not so effortful that the effort you're putting in takes away from the enjoyment. And typically, it's easy for us to get lost in these activities, to find some version of flow. So again, that's a great mental space to be in, that quieting of the mind where you're just totally in flow and enjoying the moment. Like that is restful. That is going to bring you either that sense of calm or inner peace, or that sense of being energized and galvanized. And so finding your play zone is really about reconnecting with the parts of you that are playful. I think many of us as adults, we forget that as children, we had no problem playing. There might be somebody listening to this who thinks, but I don't what is play? I don't even know how to play.
Just go be 12 again and you'll have no problem.
Yeah. So part of this, it is about looking back, and thinking about, what activities did you really love as a child? Or if that's too far back, what activities did you love, 10 years ago, that you don't
or maybe
do anymore?
even the ones you tried during the pandemic because you had nothing else to do, but that you really did love.
That's
Right?
right.
Like, I mean, I don't think this is. I love this one because I think you're right. We may have to think about it to get there, but I think we all know, and we just
Yes.
have to go do it. I knew, Ximena, this would happen, that we could go way longer, and we're already going to be longer than a lot of our podcasts, and that's okay. But I can't ask everything I had on my list. But there's another, I think, really important idea that, like many in the book, just sort of shows up, and then you're on to the next thing. It's this idea of continuous versus intermittent rest. Everybody, I think this might be the thing you most need to hear.
Yeah, continuous versus intermittent rest. What we're talking about here is the frequency in which you're giving yourself rest, and the duration, essentially. So when we look at things that we do every day to be restful, these micro moments of rest, that is going to be much more impactful than the sabbatical or the vacation, where we're kind of carving out a specific chunk of time versus day by day. And the reason for that is what usually happens when you wait to get to those moments is you burn out along the way. It takes you a long time to kind of click into vacation or sabbatical mode. Eventually you get there, but it's in this separate container that doesn't really have anything to do with your life. And so we really need to find ways to bring these restful activities into our everyday life.
Into our life, as opposed to sort of pausing life to go do this other thing. That's what I love about it.
Yes.
And I think that's so important. And, well, man, I am so burnt out now, I have to take a vacation. Well, then it doesn't even have the impact that you want it to have. And then
Right.
if it's not a great vacation, now you're putting pressure on the vacation.
That's
There's
right.
just so many things about that I think we could do differently. So because this is the Remarkable Leadership podcast, I think it's, important to realize that all of us can as leaders, can think about all these things as individuals. And if we're more rested, then we can be more effective for our teams. That is a true statement. But are there any things that you would say, if we put our leader hat on, so to speak, that we could be doing? You talked about policy sort of organizationally, but I'm talking about like everyday leader anywhere in the organization. Are there things that we should be, or you would encourage us to think about, that might help our teams around rest?
It's a great question. I think, especially if you're in a position of leadership, you have power to help design certain norms around rest. And so, just in the same way that you're probably thinking about the culture of the team you lead and what kind of culture you want and what kind of values you all are bringing to the team, thinking about rest as one of those elements, and thinking about what practices or norms could come from that. For example, maybe you don't want to be the team that is last out of the office. Maybe that's not important. Maybe you want to think about how early you schedule your meetings, or if you
Or how
are,
late you schedule
or
them,
how late
or
you
whether you
schedule
schedule
your
them on
meetings,
Friday afternoon, or
or whether you schedule a meeting at all, right? Thinking about those things. I mean, it's true. I think there can be a default to we schedule everything, but maybe we don't need to. Or, for example, if you work someplace near a park or that has some kind of walking path nearby, maybe you could take more of your one-on-ones as walking one-on-ones instead of sitting in an office. That's a way to give everybody's eyes a break from, screens or from harsh fluorescent lights. Nature is very calming. So anytime you see even just a tree with its leaves fluttering in the wind, it does something good for us. So thinking about ways, both, big and small, to the extent that you have some power within your organization, then you have the power to either help set those norms or help, kind of bring these issues up above and say, hey, we need bigger changes because these are the trends, the burnout trends that I'm seeing on the team. Like,
right.
What are some things we can do?
I love that. Thank you. So shifting gears before we finish, I want to know, and I ask every guest this, so I'm pretty sure I asked you this 140 episodes ago. What do you do for fun?
Oh, well, this is it's a good
It's
question.
especially appropriate for this particular conversation.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I've gotten back into is reading fiction. I think the last time we talked, I was on a real hard nonfiction bent.
I believe that's
And
right.
I still love nonfiction. I write nonfiction, but I think that getting into fiction has been very relaxing for me, very freeing for me, because I don't need to learn anything. I don't need to think about anything. I don't need to underline anything. And I can totally be transported into someone else's world with, characters that have their own problems. So I don't need to think about mine. So I have really been enjoying that and incorporating it into my bedtime routine as a way to also ensure that I'm not looking at my phone right before going to bed.
All right.
So
So
that's
that leads us to my other question. What are you reading? I'm guessing it's fiction.
yes.
What are you reading right now?
Yes. I just finished a book called Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano. And it's a story about four sisters. And I happen to be one of four girls myself. And it's about their relationship and their family over the years. And it's just really beautifully written, and one of those books that, pulls out relationships in a way that feels really true, family dynamics and both the good stuff and the bad stuff. And yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, the question you really want me to ask, which is, where can we learn more? Where do you want to point people? As you and I are having this conversation today, the book is not out. When this goes live on the podcast, and forever more thereafter, it will be out. But where can you point? Where do you want to point people, not only for the book, but in general, to learn more about you and your work?
Yes. The book is not out yet, but you can pre-order it, and that you can do on my website. So ximenavengoechea.com/rest-easy. And that same website is where you'll find my newsletter, social, stuff I've written in the past. Pretty much everything you can find there. So that's where I would explore.
And I think it would be safe to say, too, that if they wanted to connect with you on LinkedIn, that would be a good thing to do as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Because that's one of the places that I see tidbits from you on a regular basis. And so
That's right.
I encourage you to reach out to Ximena on LinkedIn, as well as connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love for you to do that. So, Ximena, thank you so much for being here. Before we go, everyone, though, I need to ask you the question that I ask you every single week. And maybe this week it's as important as it ever is. And that is, now what? What are you going to take from this episode? I can't imagine that there isn't something that you've gotten in the last 40 minutes that won't be of value to you if you take action. But if all you do is say, yeah, that was a good idea, or if all you do is remember to pause the next podcast while you're looking for a parking space, I'm not sure that's enough. I would really encourage you to think about what you heard from this very brilliant and wise woman today, because I think deep down, that it will make a difference for you. And it may be a hurdle or 2 or 5 for you to cross to get to it. But I believe that today you've gotten some ideas about the radical power of rest, and perhaps gotten some ideas about how to do it. So please do that. Ximena, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to spend
Thank you,
some
Kevin,
time
as
with you.
always. It was wonderful.
And if you all like this, tell someone else to come listen. If you like this, give us some stars and some ratings wherever you happen to be watching this podcast, if that's appropriate. But make sure whatever you do, you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And you can come back to join us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you then.